For most of the Third Age, the westlands of Middle-earth were dominated by the great kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, and these kingdoms would have histories that would last thousands of years. Even the kingdom of Rohan was over 500 years old by the end of the Third Age, with a storied history of its own. But very late in the Third Age, a new kingdom of men would rise in the north of Middle-earth, and by the time of the War of the Ring, it had existed only for 75 years. In this video, let's talk about the Kingdom of Dale, the new kingdom of men. On my channel, I've made several videos covering the Northmen, those men, tall and often blonde-haired, likely related to the House of Hador, who lived between the Sea of Rhûn and the Misty Mountains from the First Age onwards. Throughout the First Age, they were in alliance with the Dwarves, but the War of the Elves and Sauron in the middle of the Second Age would see them brought to the brink of destruction, clinging to the edges of their old lands. During the Third Age, and during the Zenith of Gondor, the Northmen would once again begin to grow strong, and several distinct groups emerged. Most of those videos would end up covering the Northmen of Rhovanion, who established the Kingdom of Rhovanion between the 13th and the 19th centuries of the Third Age, and were major allies of Gondor. Their descendants, the Aethiod, were equally if not more important, aiding Gondor in several key battles and eventually becoming the Rohirrim who dwelt in Rohan, Gondor's last ally in the Third Age. There were other groups too, the Woodmen who dwelt in Mirkwood and in the Vales of Anduin, and the mysterious Beornings who had the ability to shapeshift into bears. But another group of Northmen existed north of the Kingdom of Rhovanion, between the rivers Kelduin and the Carnan. This group is only ever really referred to as the Men of Dale, even though the city of Dale had yet to be founded, and although they were closely related to the Men of Rhovanion, they were still a separate people. Unfortunately, we know very little about their history throughout the Third Age. They are first mentioned when the Wainrider Easterlings overran Rhovanion, while some of the Men of Rhovanion fled to Gondor or to the Vales of Anduin. We're also told that some fled north of the river Kelduin and merged with the people of Dale. There's nothing that indicates that the Men of Dale were also overrun by the Wainriders. Either the river Kelduin was a big enough natural barrier, or the Wainriders were too focused on attacking Gondor to care about the lands to the north. The Men of Dale also seem to have survived the emergence of the Balkoth Easterlings in the late 25th century, although their surviving kinsmen to the south were less fortunate. The Men of Dale truly enter the history books in 2590. In this year, King Thror of Durin's folk led his people back to Erebor, admitting defeat in the War of the Dwarves and Dragons that had been taking place in the Grey Mountains to the north. Seeing the return of the Dwarves, some of the men who lived near to the Long Lake came north and then founded the city of Dale. Dale rapidly grew in wealth and prosperity. The Men of Dale would trade food to the Dwarves of Erebor, who in return would provide the Men of Dale with their crafts. Dale became renowned for its bells and markets, and trade flourished down the Long Lake and the river Kelduin. Unfortunately, the wealth acquired by the Dwarves of Erebor and the Men of Dale would result in the arrival of an unwanted guest, Smaug the Golden, last of the Great Dragons. He came down upon Erebor and Dale in 2770. After setting fire to the woods around the mountains, he landed before the gates of Erebor, where he dealt with the dwarves rushing out to meet him. While this was happening, the warriors of Dale, led by their lord, Girion, also rushed out to face the dragon, but they were enveloped by a fog created by steam from the river and were also killed. Smaug then entered Erebor and killed every dwarf he could find. Dale was not finished right away. Despite the death of Girion and his soldiers, the people seem to have tried to hold on to their town, hoping that the dragon would remain in Erebor. Unfortunately, this was not the case, and usually by night, Smaug would crawl out and fly to Dale, carrying away people to eat, usually young women. By the end of the year, the terror was too much to bear, and the survivors of Dale, including Girion's wife and son, fled to the south, merging with the people who dwelt around the Long Lake. Dale was left in ruins and became part of the desolation of Smaug. At this point, the closest settlement to the mountain was Esgaroth, Lake Town, built upon the Long Lake. Although populated by the same people, Lake Town had always been independent of Dale, ruled by a democratically elected Master of Lake Town. That said, Lake Town's fortunes were very much tied to Dale. In the years that followed, much of the town, especially that which existed on the shore, fell into ruins and was abandoned. And while trade continued down the river Kelduin or to the elves in Mirkwood to the west, it did not compare to the years when boats laden with gold used to travel up and down the lake. So it was that when Thorin's company arrived, many of the townsfolk, being descended from and remembering legends of the wealth and prosperity of Dale, welcomed him with open arms. The master of Laketown, although skeptical of Thorin's claims and ideas, decided he had no choice but to support the dwarves and gave them supplies for the journey north. Unfortunately for the men of Laketown, their aid to the dwarves was uncovered by Smaug, partly because Bilbo let slip the name Barrel Rider during their conversation. He had allowed the men of Laketown to live in peace. In fact, he hadn't been seen for so many years that many of them doubted his existence. But now, they had to pay. And so they did. Smaug fell upon Laketown in the night, he destroyed the bridge to land, and then started setting fire to the town. Most of the townsfolk, including the master, immediately began to flee. However, a single company of archers held their ground, led by a man named Bard. He was grim, aloof, and treated unfairly by many of the townsfolk, as he was of the line of Girion, last Lord of Dale. With his final arrow, his lucky black arrow, Bard managed to shoot down Smaug, who landed on the remnants of Laketown and died amidst the water and steam of the lake. Bard was immediately hailed as a hero. Thanks to his killing of the dragon, 3/4 of the townsfolk had managed to escape. Some even began to hail him as a king, much to the annoyance of the master, who pointed out that the people of Laketown had always elected their own lords, and that if Bard wanted to be king, he should go back and rebuild Dale. Nothing was stopping him now. This planted the seed in Bard's mind, and he decided that he now had business with Erebor and whoever survived there. But first, showing his kingly quality, he directed efforts to give the survivors of Laketown food and shelter, although in the master's name. Hearing that Thranduil, king of the woodland elves, was on the march towards Erebor, he sent messengers requesting aid, and Thranduil, being of good nature, wheeled his army around and marched to the Long Lake. There, the elves provided further assistance, and the beginnings of a new lake town, further to the north of the old one, started to be drawn up. But, unwilling to delay any longer, Bard took as many men as he could spare, and joined them with Thranduil's army. Together, they marched on Erebor. Of course, against expectations, they found Thorin and his company alive. Bard began negotiating with Thorin, asking for the share of the wealth of the mountain that Smaug had stolen from Dale. He also expected compensation for the fact that A, he had slain the dragon, and B, the dragon had destroyed Laketown. Thorin was far from diplomatic, rejecting any proposal as long as an army of elves remained camped outside the mountain. When a messenger was dispatched again with the official terms, at least 1/12 of the treasure of the mountain, Thorin shot at him with a bow. Battle seemed inevitable, as unknown to both Thranduil and Bard, Thorin had summoned the dwarves of the Iron Hills, led by Dane Ironfoot. When 500 dwarves arrived, it seemed that battle was about to be joined. The men of Laketown and the elves of Mirkwood on one side against the dwarves on the other. Fortunately, a new arrival had rather poor timing. Orcs of the north, led by Bolg, son of Azog. Hearing of Smaug's death, they too wished to claim the treasure. Putting aside their differences, the elves, men and dwarves fought against the orcs and wargs in what would be known as the Battle of the Five Armies. Although the Free Peoples were victorious, Thorin Oakenshield was killed and Dane Ironfoot would become king under the mountain. Dane, at least, was far more wise than his cousin. In the end, Bard ended up with 1/14 of the share of the treasure of Erebor, which was still an enormous amount of wealth. He used some to rebuild Dale, which was completed in 2944, and Bard became its first king. Hearing of the refounding of Dale and the kingdom under the mountain, many Northmen who dwelt to the west and south of Dale joined Bard in settling the city. During his reign, the power of Dale began to expand both south and to the east. Bard also donated some to the Master of Laketown, and while Laketown was rebuilt, the Master ended up stealing a lot of the treasure, fleeing into the wilds where he eventually died of starvation. The new Master was far wiser, and between Bard's rule in Dale and the Masters in Laketown, trade and prosperity was restored between the two cities. It's unclear if Laketown remained independent of Dale, but I'd say probably not, as it specifically said that Bard's rule extended south of the Long Lake, and on top of that, Bard was also the saviour of Laketown as well. When Bard died in 2977, he had been king of Dale for 33 years, As we don't know his date of birth, we don't know how old he was when he died, probably over the age of 70 at least. He was succeeded by his son, Bane. Once again, we don't know his date of birth, but we know that he died in 3007, having ruled for 30 years. He was succeeded by his son, Brand. By the reign of Brand, the wealth and prosperity of the Kingdom of Dale was the envy of the Northern lands. The bells were tolling once again, the markets were back in action, and some of those goods could even be found in the Shire. According to the dwarves, the waterways of the city were unmatched in beauty. On top of that, Brand's kingdom had expanded far to the south and east, reaching the rivers Kelduin and Carnan, probably absorbing all of the Northmen who lived in those lands. The alliance between the dwarves of Erebor, still ruled by King Dain, and the men of Dale was also as strong as ever. Unfortunately, there would be one final test for Dale. In the lead up to the War of the Ring, Sauron sent both emissaries to Dale and Erebor, offering rewards for any news about the one named Baggins. The or else was quite simple. Easterlings were now gathering beyond the River Carnan, and in Rivendell, although Glóin, father of Gimli, described Brand as a strong king, he was still afraid that the men of Dale might yield in the face of war. But King Brand did not yield. By the 14th of March, 3019, the same day Minas Tirith was besieged, an army of Easterlings had crossed the Carnan, and King Brand had fallen back to Dale. An army of Dale men and dwarves then gathered outside Erebor, and for 3 days they fought the Easterlings in what would be known as the Battle of Dale. This battle would end in defeat. King Brand was killed late in the fighting, and King Dain Ironfoot was killed shortly afterwards, defending his fallen comrade. However, many survivors, both men and dwarves, managed to take refuge inside Erebor, and the Easterlings could not break through. And nor would they. A week into the siege, the One Ring was destroyed, and Sauron died alongside it. Shortly afterwards, word reached the Easterlings at Erebor. Their king, and to some, probably even a god, was gone, and the morale collapsed. On the 27th, Bard II and Thorin III Stonehelm, the new kings of Dale and Erebor respectively, sallied forth and defeated the demoralized Easterlings. They fled beyond the Carnan, and apparently never returned. The new kings then sent ambassadors to the coronation of King Elessar in Gondor. They would remain independent, yet under the protection of the King of the West, and both realms would remain friends of Gondor as long as they lasted. How long that was, into the Fourth Age and beyond, is unknown. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. Unfortunately, there's not enough about Dale for it to earn its own complete history podcast type video. But hey, that doesn't mean it can't have a longer length normal video to itself. Speaking of the longer podcast type video, there's another one on the way. Spoiler alert, you can find giant elephants there. Cheers, farewell, and remember, every time I think of the Kingdom of Dale, I just think of Dale from King of the Hill, which is honestly really unfortunate.